Hi, hello, and welcome back to Science as Process and Perspective. We talked about scientific progress in the last lecture. If we take perspectivism serious, how can we define that we're making progress? So we're limited beings, our scientific theories are constructed, they depend on our current biases or the questions we can ask at the moment and so on and so forth. And we looked at the question of how can you talk about progress. I explained that you can judge the progress of science empirically, say, okay, it's an empirical success. And I also sort of pointed out that that probably means that we actually, I mean, we do replace theories that are outdated. We replace those parts of those theories that for which we have better solutions, that there's some sort of community agreement that they provide better solutions. And not only that, but we have made progress in the way we actually apply the scientific method, and what that scientific method actually is has changed over time. And we now have sort of different criteria to accept scientific theories than the ancients had when they sort of trained their intuition through experience. And so this is a lecture that the next two lectures are not going to sort of be guided by questions, or only one question maybe. The central question here is, what is the nature of reality really? That reality that we're assuming to be true, and that we're assuming that science does capture better and better over time, although not in a sort of a steady progression, as I told you last time, but with sort of sudden, long, steady periods interrupted by sort of revolution, bigger and smaller ones. So, and a process that is not entirely rational. We're going to get back to that question later on. But let's talk first about what it means to look at reality as process itself, because not only is science and scientific knowledge a process, but also the whole of reality can be seen as one gigantic process full of little processes that are interacting in all kinds of really intricate ways. And that goes together with this sort of spirit that we took from the lecture before the last one, where Ron Geary was writing, we want to switch our investigation from representation, from the facts that science is producing, to the activity of representing, a shift of our focus from the products of science to the process based on scientific practice. But for that, we need tools to look at processes. Okay, we need a complete change of perspective. And so we're going to do something here is a beautiful quote by Alfred North Whitehead. We're going to do something that's both sort of trivial maybe, but also very radical. Let's motivate this by this wonderful quote by Whitehead. He says, when you are criticizing the philosophy of an epoch, do not chiefly direct your attention to those intellectual positions which its exponents feel it necessary explicitly to defend. There will be some fundamental assumptions which adherents of all the variant systems within the epoch unconsciously presuppose. Such assumptions appear so obvious that people do not know that they are assuming, because no other way of putting things has ever occurred to them. And he goes on to say, if you can actually question these very fundamental assumptions of your time, you're going to find something new. So this sort of thing that we're aiming at here is the fact that as human beings, one limitation we have is we always focus on the things that are constant. So look at these pictures swapping back and forth. Here's the Eiffel Tower. You see, you immediately focus on the tower. And then as a second thing, you sort of look around. The river is still there, of course, but you see all these other buildings that have sort of vanished after the World Exhibition and have been replaced by park and a lot of expensive, very expensive apartment buildings. So change is universal in the world, but we generally tend to explain it in terms of static entities. And that is a very sort of broad phenomenon, because substance-based explanations are deeply entrenched in our thinking as human beings. Basically, everyone starts out as a common sense substantivist. When you grow up, you can actually do, experiments with growing children, and you can show that they think of the world as sort of boxes with boxes in them. This is called the doctrine of containment. Developmental psychologist George Lakoff has done beautiful work on this and written about it together with Johnson in their 1980 book, Metaphors We Live By. It's beautifully summarized there. So Lakoff says that, for developing children, the world is a kind of container bearing objects that change location and properties over time. These objects cause things to happen by interacting directly with one another. Prototypically, they move each other about by banging into each other. So this is the view that we develop of the world intuitively and first. It's pretty universal. Even Eastern cultures need to sort of, if you become an Eastern mystic, a Buddhist monk, then you need to sort of unlearn this doctrine of containment, to see the world, to experience the world as process. And it's a hierarchical sort of world of containers, like these Russian dolls with smaller dolls in them. Objects are containers in turn, whose properties are explained by the objects they contain. A little similar to Wimsatt's levels of organization, but that was much more dynamic. So here you really have Tupperware boxes with Tupperware boxes in them. Tupperware view of the world. And our language and relational logic, that's very important, are shaped by this structure. It primes us to ask, what is the world ultimately made of? So our language is centered around nouns. Relational logic is built on set theory, which is the ultimate sort of container mathematical theory. And so it's really hard to get out of this sort of pattern of thinking, even though it may be quite obvious that everything is a process. It's hard for us to grasp it, to talk about it, to define processes. That's what this lecture is about. So Alfred North Whitehead, famous process philosopher, of course, called this the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, the error of mistaking the abstract for the concrete. So basically, he says, we learn from such a young age to see the world as sort of containers, and our theories that are abstractions, the theory of physics, for example, treat the world as containers. We take those for the ultimate grounding of reality. Everything needs to, correspond to those laws of physics, but we have seen earlier that they are social constructs, cultural constructs. They are derived, everything is derived from our experience and our abstractions from that experience. And experience is fundamentally processual. So what we're doing is we're abstracting things from our processual experience, and we take those abstractions as fundamental, and taking an abstraction as fundamental, mistaking the map for the territory, that is what the fallacy of misplaced concreteness is. So we need to sort of unlearn that and try to see the world as it is, the reality as it is. Okay? And especially the scientific tradition in the West, Western philosophy, and with it, the scientific worldview, largely adhere to a substance or object-based philosophy. Substance is fundamental, and processes are epiphenomena or derived properties of things. So you have a bunch of things and they interact. Even a relational worldview is focusing on the relationship between things. While in reality, any sort of stable thing is just a slow process. That's what I will try to convince you of during this lecture. We can discuss about this. And what's hugely problematic with this view, mainly, there are a lot of problematic aspects of it, but the most problematic one is that these things that we postulate, they exhibit some sort of agency, and that agency is often very mysterious. So doing stuff is what, is very much in the nature of things. It's a fundamental aspect of their being. For example, elementary particles that we encountered in the standard model of physics last time. They do stuff. They create all the phenomena of the world. Or genes as determinants of heredity, form, physiology, and behavior in biology. These are all things, and the burden is really on explaining what they do and how they do it. It can really go wrong sometimes. For example, think about genetic determinism. Here in the 90s, there was a big sort of brouhaha about what was called the gay gene, sort of a locus on one of the human chromosomes that was statistically associated with being gay. And people said, look, the gay gene, here it is. This is science. The big question, of course, is how does this sequence on the DNA that's completely inert, how does it make you gay? Of course, it doesn't make you gay. What it does make is a protein that is, only made in certain circumstances. So it depends on all the other sort of factors in a living cell. And it's very complicated to actually explain, to go beyond the statistical association and say, okay, so here is a sort of a causal chain that leads from this sequence in your genome to being gay. And probably, I would very heavily bet this involves a lot of environmental factors, societal factors, your social and natural environment that you grow up in, and so on and so forth. It's a very complicated process. And so it's very sort of simple to say, okay, a gene does this or that without reflecting on what that actually means, because agency is a difficult concept. I can tell you from my work in biology that the only processes maybe, that have agency in biology are organisms. Genes don't do anything. So there are huge problems if we interrupt this idea of gene agency. And that's created by this gap between having this substance-based view that we need sort of particles, things to explain processes. There's always a gap between the sort of fundamental entities we postulate and the phenomena they create. The solution to this, of course, is process philosophy. And here's Nicholas Rescher again, who we encountered in the last lecture. He writes, process metaphysics as a general line of approach holds that physical existence is at bottom processual. Everything is a process. The processes, rather than things, best represent the phenomena that we encounter in a natural world. Okay, a little caveat here. I'm going to do my best to convince you that this is actually true, because this is my conviction and I have reasons. But again, this is a philosophical metaphysical stance, so you can have a different stance and you can defend it rationally. But you don't even have to believe my argument that everything is a process. You don't have to buy into process metaphysics to appreciate the epistemological and methodological value of the approach. Changing perspectives, remember, gives you a new view, gives you a much better insight into the limitations of your old view and a completely different view on what it actually gets right. Remember that? So let's change perspective. You don't have to be a process metaphysicist, but you just have to agree that it's a useful exercise to try and do that and see the world as a process instead of a thing. And of course, this has a long-standing philosophical tradition. It's always been a minority view, which is weird because, to me, it's the most obvious thing in the world. Thing. It's really hard to avoid the word thing when you talk about processes. So you can have a drinking game and, drink every time I say thing in a process philosophy lecture. It's terrible. You'll be terribly drunk by the end of the lecture. Process philosophy starts, of course, with Heraclitus. Well, arguably, we could say that the Milesians. Remember Anaximander and his Apeiron. That was already a pretty process-oriented view of the world. But the first big process philosopher is Heraclitus, who's famous for his fragments that we found that are very sort of, big aphorisms. And one of them is everything flows. He also said that you cannot step into the same river twice, which is a bit more controversial. I think you can step in the same river twice. You cannot step in the same water flowing through the river twice. There's also a great paper that I recommend, which is called the waterfall doesn't fall, but the water, well, no, the other way around. The water falls, but the waterfall doesn't fall. So here we have Heraclitus. He's the weeping philosopher. He's very mysterious, and he's probably weeping because nobody took him serious and his processual view of the world. But his line of thinking, the idea he was very big on the element of fire and said, the whole world, another quote from him is, the whole world is strife, sort of a fight between opposites. It's not necessarily war, it's often misrepresented today, but it's sort of a strife between different tendencies, a strife for balance. And so that theory goes on through the ages. Here are a few big sort of figures in that tradition. Leibniz, he had a theory, the theory of monads, where he had these little processes that had a sort of a proto consciousness that made up, they were little almost holographic representations of the whole universe. They were dependent on everything else in the universe, and each one of those monads had something called appetition, which is sort of a basic sort of even consciousness of the world, although it's not like similar to modern consciousness. It's a very interesting view. And of course, his process-based views led Leibniz, together with Newton, to invent calculus, a very big process philosopher, often maligned in biology today because of his vitalism, is Henri Bergson, who wrote a book called Creative Evolution. Very important contributions to evolutionary thinking. And of course, process thinking is extremely important in biology. Little known, especially in Europe, the American pragmatists, William James, Sanders Peirce, and John Dewey, who made great contributions to process thinking. Especially Dewey is not very well known. He's absolutely fantastic. I recommend reading. And then Whitehead is the most famous process philosopher, I would say, in history. He was one of the last big metaphysicians who came up with a whole sort of big process theory. He called that the theory of the organism. We'll get back to that in a second. In the continental tradition in France, you have philosophers like Gilles Deleuze and Georges Canguilhem, who made important contributions to process thinking. And in a more analytical Anglo-Saxon tradition, you have modern philosophers like Johannes Seid, John Dupre, and Mark Bickhardt, who do really good work in contemporary process philosophy. So this is an active and alive sort of tradition in philosophy, but still a sort of a vast, a small minority. And so the most famous process philosopher is probably Alfred North Whitehead. And he had a very interesting view of the world. So I just want to spend 2 minutes on that. He called it, his metaphysics, the philosophy of the organism. And so he basically, I'm not going to do him justice here, but he said the universe is really more not like an organism than a clockwork. Okay, it's got all these processes that are interacting, and just like an organism, it's also self-constituting. It doesn't have anything outside it. So it's self-supporting. He saw nature as a manifold of diffused processes, all phenomena as sort of subject to a pervasive growth and decay cycle. Everything perishes. The world is made of actual occasions. So he's often been accused of not being a real process philosopher because he said the fundamental aspects of the world are these actual occasions. Those are not things, but they're living units of elemental experience. Experience is very important. So he also held the view that the universe has an infinite content that you can experience. And these actual occasions are instances of experience. They are not substances, but processual particulars, more like events maybe of experience. And evolution he saw as a creative process, and that's very important. A perpetual emergence through concretions. And concretions is sort of the coming together in new ways of different processes, like they have never come together before. And so what's really great here is not just that we can shift the focus from, we take this burden away of explaining agency. Everything is sort of doing stuff in a processual universe, but also the history of the universe becomes open. It's not a closed mechanistic clockwork sort of system. It becomes open-ended and sort of an evolving world. I really recommend Whitehead's book, Science and the Modern World. And if you're a little more daring, you can try his Process in Reality, which is a really difficult book that I'm still struggling with a lot. But Science and the Modern World is highly recommended. And so coming forth to the modern times, here is Johannes Seid, and she takes up this sort of idea of Whitehead's in her article, The Myth of Substance and the Fallacy of Misplaced Concreteness. And she makes the argument that processes are fundamental for several reasons. So the first reason is that a thing cannot even be perceived if it doesn't do anything. So to have an interaction with a thing, it needs to do something, right? I mean, so if experience is just has to be a processual phenomenon, it's about interaction, it's about relationships, and those only happen through processes. Okay, that's one sort of point. But the main point in this paper is that there is no thing that is not involved in a process, arguably. I mean, if you can find a thing that is important, as I just said, you cannot even perceive it if it's not involved in a process. But there are processes that are not things. And she uses, for example, the activity of snowing as an example. So it is snowing. Of course, snow consists of snowflakes. They are themselves very transient entities. They are processes, obviously. But it's also not the snowflakes that make the snowing. How many snowflakes do you need for snowing? That's a very difficult problem. It's equivalent to the sort of the paradox of the heap, classical, when you have one sand corn, two sand corns. How many sand corns make a heap? Where's the sort of transition to heapness? Where's the transition to snowing? It's like any other process, it's vague, a little vague, okay, a little fuzzy around the boundaries. It's difficult to pin down. This is one of the reasons why we have so many problems thinking about processes. Processes are hard to pin down, to delimit, things or boxes. They're easier to delimit. You can point to them. They're more concrete, although that's misplaced concreteness, as Whitehead points out. But the main point that Johanna Seid is making here is that the activity of snowing, it's not localized necessarily. It can happen in all kinds of different places. It's snowing here, or it's snowing in Switzerland or wherever. Okay, and you can recognize it as snowing. So snowing is not sort of defined by its spatio-temporal boundaries, but by the activity that consists the snowing. And this activity is not based on any single entity. There's no thing that does the snowing. There is no, as she calls, there's no subjects. She calls those processes subjectless processes. So basically, snowing is an activity that is not directed by any central sort of agency. Okay, it's just happening. It's distributed all over the place. It cannot be really localized. And she builds up a sort of a metaphysical theory out of that, general process theory. Absolutely beautiful work. And so the argument is you have processes that are not things, but you don't have things that are not involved in processes, and therefore process is more fundamental. The other argument you could make is that a process-based approach has more explanatory power. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But it's hard, why is process thinking such a minority position? If, as I said, it's pretty obvious. If you think about it, it's obvious that change is everywhere. I mean, even if you maybe have a problem with me saying that things don't really exist, it's not like you can deny that change exists. It's everywhere, and it's directly, we experience it. But it's hard to grasp, okay? Even before Willard von Orman Quine here, David Hume had a problem with process. He had a problem with causality. He said we cannot establish just by looking, we measure, something happens, then something else happens. Sort of a habit that one thing happens after the other. But again, we cannot be sure that this is really causality, okay? I guess he never hit his toe on a doorpost or something like that. That's directly experienced causality. You experience process directly, maybe not by looking at it, but by living it. I mean, that's one problem. But the other problem is that it's really hard to talk about process. And so Willard von Orman Quine, in a little article here, takes process thinking ad absurdum because he says, look, we cannot even talk about processes because we say a white cat is facing a dog and bristling. But if we take this notion of cats and dogs being processes seriously, we would instead have to say it's catting whitely, bristlingly, and dogwardly. And it would be impossible to have any sort of normal conversation. like this. This idea is taken even further by Argentinian novelist Jorge Luis Borges in this absolutely wonderful story, Plön, Uqbar, and Orbus Tertius, in which he invents a fictional world called Plön. And so it has a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere, and in neither one of those hemispheres do people have nouns, stable nouns to denote objects in their language. So in the northern hemisphere, as far as I remember, they only use different sort of combinations of adjectives that denote whatever combination of things you see at the moment. Nothing is stable, okay? And these sort of different properties that go together, they're very fleeting. As long as you don't pay attention to an object anymore, it basically ceases to exist. It's an extreme form of idealism. It's sort of a play on Bishop Berkeley's philosophy, but that's not important here. What's important is that on the other hemisphere of the planet, they have a language that doesn't use nouns, only verbs. So you would express the moon rose above the river as upward behind the onstreaming it mooned. And Borges, being Borges, of course, also provides a Plönian translation where that sort of that's like a, a ridiculing laughter, the sound of ridiculing laughter, because you cannot do anything with this sort of language. Okay, you cannot build up a stable and structured account of the world with language like that. So, is this project completely absurd? Is it absurd to do process thinking? So let's try and actually define what a process is. I haven't done this yet. So well, it's difficult, I tell you. So here's one of the best sort of attempts at a precise definition from Nicholas Rescher's Process Metaphysics book that I found, and it still has many problems. He says, a process is a coordinated group of changes in the complexion of reality, an organized family of occurrences that are systematically linked to one another, either causally or functionally. So what coordinates the group of changes? That's already difficult. What is the complexion of reality here? What are occurrences? Again, just like the actual occurrences of Whitehead, are these things, events? What are they? How are they systematically linked to one another? It requires some sort of notion of causality and flow. And functional, of course, is a word that we don't it's so loaded, it's very difficult. So there are a lot of sort of difficult conceptual issues here to unpack. But again, I want you to remember, we grow up with a language and a relational logic that makes it easy for us to speak about things. And remember the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It is therefore easy to mistake the things we find it easy to talk about for reality. But there is no guarantee that just because we find it easy, it must be so. Okay? That's the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So we must try and be specific about processes. And it's not hopeless. So, and actually, it has a lot of advantages if we manage. Let's go through that first. Let's sort of compare if you do process-based thinking and thing-based thinking. What are the different aspects of your thinking? One that is very important is that if you switch to a process-based perspective, you see the connections and relations between things everywhere, and you treat them as fundamentally important. While, of course, thing-based thinking leads to some sort of reductionism very often. That is often very successful, but only within limits, where you can isolate a phenomenon as a thing, you can delimit it and separate it from the rest of the world. But every act of separating an object from the rest of the world, remember Gregory Bateson, I brought him up already, a difference that makes a difference. By making that difference between that thing and the rest of the world, they are together, they interact. Okay, and every object in the universe is somehow influenced by the whole rest of the universe. Although most of those interactions are very, very weak. Herbert Simon's near decomposability. But still, here we focus on the isolation of the thing, and there we focus on the interconnectedness of everything. Processes are continuous, while things are discrete. And so a lot of our experience is continuous, and we can bridge that gap through process thinking. Processes are open-ended. I talked about that briefly when we talked about Whitehead. So process-oriented views of the world will encounter Stuart Kaufman, maybe Lee Smolin later on, and those are scientific worldviews that are process-based. They're open. They allow for an open future, open evolution, while thing-based views are bounded, and the focus is on delimiting the boundaries of things. Process views are infinite. That's included in the open, or things are always finite one way or another. And of course, a process view is much more holistic, is based on the systems level, on different levels. And so it's much more compatible with a view like Bill Wimsatt's rainforest ontology, which Wimsatt treats explicitly as an evolutionary view of the world. And that's part of his metaphor of the rainforest there. So a processual view of the world. While, of course, thing-based thinking is, as I said before already, much more conducive to reductionism, to take everything apart into its components and analyze those components in isolation. Okay, so how do we identify and characterize a process? Based on that sort of Rescher's definition, that's not very easy, right? So the problem here is that it's impossible to delimit exact spatial and temporal boundaries, and it's important to consider different criteria for defining processes. Remember the example of the snowing. So there's time scale, there's some sort of continuity and cohesion of a system that is important. Processes, that's also of the same kind, that's also an important criterion. They share a common structure. What do I mean by that? So they have rules that govern how the occurrence follows from another and how this leads to organized change over time. So think about the snowing. So this is a particular way, a particular activity, a particular form of precipitation. It's not raining. It can sort of rain and snow in the same place. Okay, then you get sleet or slush. And, so again, the boundaries are not clearly delimited, but you can define them by their sort of intrinsic activities. And so there are criteria by which you can render processes identifiable, reproducible, and classifiable. So we can work with them. Okay, it's not completely hopeless, but it's difficult. So if we want to make this big switch in perspective from a thing-based perspective on the world to a process-based perspective, it needs to pay off bigly, okay? Otherwise, it's not worth it, because the cognitive sort of effort is much bigger if you think and talk about processes. So we need to justify why we should do this. And I want to do this by two sort of concrete examples, which will fill up the rest of the lectures for this course. And the next lecture is a brief lecture that shows you a concrete example of how this kind of thinking can be used in biology to come to a different kind of biology. While we'll spend the last two lectures then looking at the activity of doing science, science as a process, where we'll focus first on sort of individual contributions to the process, and in the last lecture to societal and historical aspects of it. Okay, so this was a little excursion into process thinking. Now that we have the tools, we'll go back to looking at process thinking in the concrete setting of doing science. And I hope you tune in again next time. Thanks for listening. Goodbye now.